my question concerns, I guess, the cultural background and cultural climate that allows such a creeping erosion of civil liberties. And an interesting argument when you compare Australia to New Zealand, where there hasn't been such an erosion of civil liberties in the last 15 years, is the different origins of the two countries. Australia with the convict origins, which had a big sort of formation on the character in Australia compared to New Zealand, where they didn't have that. And perhaps in the past, until the last 15 years or so, when it was, well, relatively free in comparison to a fair bit of the world, I guess, but maybe that was more due to good luck rather than sort of any particular strong sort of tendencies in the Australian culture. And certainly another thing which allows such a creeping culture to grow stronger is the lack of concern that seems to be the case. On some issues like erosion of working rights and so on, we're still pretty good in resisting that, environmental things and so on, but not so much, sadly, when it comes to fighting for our civil rights and so on. So I guess the question is, to what extent would you say it's something that's unfortunately maybe due in part to the sort of underlying culture in Australia with the convict past and so on?
Yes, I mean, for this talk tonight, I was hoping to add a little section at the end, which I certainly ran out of time about, but it was basically about where does this come from, this panic and this shock and so on and so on. And when you think about it, I think Abbott, but also Rudd and Gillard and so on and so on, play on our deepest fears in Australia about the other. And the other has been China, Chinese people, Japan coming down, Russia. In fact, I remember going to a Warrnambool obelisk facing towards Antarctica, waiting for the Russian fleet in kind of 1889 to arrive and invade Australia. So that idea of, you know, these different other people, I think is deeply part of Australian psyche. Of course, the very worst is how we regard Aboriginal people, and I apologise for not making my own statement about that at the beginning of my speech. But so the other, which is so fabulously portrayed in David Malouf's books about the spectre of the other, which is the Aboriginal people, I think is mirrored in our inability to deal with Asian people and so on and so on. So I think there is, I'm not sure whether you were actually suggesting it is actually part of our convict thing or not.
Sort of relation to authority, I guess, is the key thing.
Yes.
Deference to authority.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because I think Australians have an ambiguous relationship with authority. They love it and hate it. Sometimes they love it and sometimes they hate it, and that, I think that's quite another thing. But I think there's something about people outside our country, which John Howard so, you know, agonisingly hit when it was about, you know, we will decide who comes to our country and so on and so on. So I do think there is some strand that, and the Labor Party is very much part of it, of course, as the inventors of White Australia. So it's not a party thing, and I do think it's an Australian problem. Racism is an Australian problem.
I think the other thing that has got us to this position so quickly in just 15 years is that that sort of laconic, laid-back element in our culture was part of the reason why for 2 centuries the structures that protected our civil liberties, the sort of golden thread that ran through our criminal justice system, the restraint on the executive, the respect for the rights of individuals, they were protected more by good habits than by good structures or good laws. And we never formalised those good habits into a set of identifiable rights. And having never formalised them into rights at the second half of the 20th century, when that rights, that growth of rights and a global movement to formalise rights was happening, we just never got around, partly for cultural reasons, partly for political convenience. We never formalised those rights in a Bill of Rights or in other formal structures that protect our rights. And so when all those rights suddenly were challenged in the last 15 years, the only thing that has stopped the erosion of them have been good habits. And it's amazingly how quickly those good habits have fallen away. And for me, that's why the erosion has been so quick and so rapid and so thorough.
Speakers, you've given us a lot of food for thought. I'd like to ask you this issue, or these issues, what can we do about this? And I'm offering you 4 areas to comment on, not all. One of them may be a lack of leadership, Abbott, and I was going to say Costello, but I meant Shorten, although you would know the difference. No Bill of Rights. We should have a Bill of Rights. We should be challenging governments wherever we can. And thirdly, the peddling of fear by the media. It's a great motivator to get people to do what they want to do. In fact, the last one is aimed at Stewart and university. I got you. No one should be graduating from university without having done a course in ethics. Thank you.
I agree with the top three that you were mentioning. I'm not sure about ethics will fix the problem from an academic point of view. So I'd hand that to Stuart to solve.
Look, authoritarianism is as alive and well in universities as it is in other institutions. They love militarization, they love corporatization, they love privatization, they love authoritarianism. In a way, the concern with the state of the grass verges and with the notion that the university is really a business corporation now and education is a long way down the list is sad and very debilitating.
Well, I'd agree with your top three, and I'd probably defer to others on the university point. But my experience with the University of Sydney, for example, in efforts I've had just to get information out of them, has shown them to be a very authoritarian, closed kind of structure, the antithesis of a sort of traditional university. Absolutely, part of the answer is in getting a Bill of Rights up, and absolutely part of the answer is in building a public movement and ensuring that discussion about a Bill of Rights is not some esoteric discussion about what a lawyer and a judge will do for you, but saying actually a Bill of Rights is going to give you more freedom of movement as you walk down the street. It's going to protect your personal information. It's what it does for you as an individual in a modern state, and that's a hard. I mean, I have found it politically very hard to get traction on in any kind of public forum, especially in the media, about why we need a Bill of Rights. I mean, even the obvious fact that Australia is pretty much the only developed Western society, country, jurisdiction without a Bill of Rights, without a national Bill of Rights. And New South Wales doesn't even have some sort of pretense at a state level of a Bill of Rights. Even that doesn't seem to motivate people to generate a movement. But that is the challenge. Obviously, that's what we need. How do we go about it? We need to actually make it real to people, not just some sort of esoteric discussion.
I think none of us will be surprised to hear that Abbott was not a terribly popular figure. However, his greatest card, whenever he thought he was at risk, was to call on security. And we're in danger. And then people would rally because they were being scared. As for Me Too, Bill Shorten, he was always worried that people would question his loyalty and his concern for the security of our country. That's my theory about what was going on. What do you think about that?
Undoubtedly, I mean, politicians have known for millennia that one of the best way of motivating people is to apply to that, to make your pitch to that lizard part of our brain that's still there, that responds to fear and flight and anxiety. It's right there in the middle of our brainstem and is a huge motivator in our day-to-day activities. And they just hammer in on that with a great emotional argument, which has enormous resonance. And that sort of fear and anxiety is one of the single best ways of motivating people. And it is so much easier to tap into that little bit of our lizard brain than it is to make the pitch about love and kindness and generosity of spirit, which is, tragically, I think, harder to motivate mass people on, harder to motivate people for an instantaneous response, in a sort of instant click, instant phone call, instant email. It's part of the human condition, and it's part of the challenge of a progressive political movement about how you motivate people to get beyond that sort of initial lizard part of our brain that is extraordinarily powerful, and we should recognise it.
But I must say, in media terms, it's shocking, first of all, how quickly the media, in general, pick up the government mantra. That hitting that response that David's talking about. But it's also difficult for citizens like us. When Tony Abbott comes out and says, look what they do, they behead people. They behead people. They are evil incarnate. Never have we seen people so Hitlerian, as this. Now, every time we've had a Middle East problem, that person has been Hitler. It was Saddam Hussein, and then now it's, what's his name in Syria?
Assad.
Yeah. And they're always Hitler and, incredibly evil. When it comes to beheading goes, Shakespeare talks about, Macbeth, etc., etc., etc. There's beheadings all through Shakespeare's things. The Vikings were good at beheadings. The Japanese were good at beheadings in the Second World War. It's not something that is just an ISIS thing. And yet, I suppose my point is, it's so difficult at that time when Abbott is sounding so triumphant at the measure of evil that these people are, that they behead people. I mean, Saudi Arabia beheads people every week. So it's so hard to say this is normality. Historically and in the present day, there's still. I mean, what about the capital punishment that occurs in the United States?
I was just wondering about Mohammed Hanif. He was almost stitched up by the executive until his courageous lawyer and a journalist with the Australian came out with a bit of truth, and the case fell apart. It showed that it was a fiasco. My question is, were his lawyer and the journalist let off because it was becoming embarrassing for the government? And second question, David, you recently had an inquiry into the police taping other police to uncover corruption. It turned out to be more of an operation to get rid of honest cops. Can you tell me what's the latest developments regarding this inquiry?
I think you answered your own question, first of all, and the answer is yes. The embarrassment was what ultimately achieved an outcome in that, as opposed to some wonderful legal outcome. In terms of the police bugging scandal, which goes back, just predates September 11, actually, goes from about 1998 through to about 2000. It just ended in 2001. There were secret police units that had come out of the Royal Commission into police corruption that thought they still had Royal Commission powers and didn't have to trouble themselves with niceties of the law before they whacked out a whole lot of listening device warrants against hundreds and hundreds of people. And then they would apply in one affidavit to a Supreme Court judge to get a warrant that covered 100. We saw one warrant that covered 114 people in one application. Now, we actually, in that case, had the affidavit that was presented. And there were, I think, 48 of the 114 people who were on the warrant had not a single allegation made out against them in the affidavit that was supported. But it went to a Supreme Court judge in a closed session with nobody contradicting it. So it's just the police and the judge in closed session, not actually normally done in chambers, not even done in a court. Nobody testing the evidence, nobody checking the evidence. And the warrant was rubber stamped, and the listening device warrants and the wiretaps were rolled out on all 114 people at the discretion of the police. That judge, of course, is Virginia Bell, who was counsel assisting in the Police Royal Commission, who many people would see as a sort of poster child of sort of libertarian left, who went from being a Supreme Court judge and is now a High Court judge. And how it is that she signed off on a warrant covering 114 people with an affidavit that didn't mention 48 of them, other than in a list at the beginning of the affidavit that says these are the 114 people listed, is a mystery to this day, has never been explained. But don't you worry, because the Chief Justice Bathurst of the Supreme Court, has decided that in future applications, this is the great reform, in future applications judges will have to give reasons for why they do the warrant. And the reasons will be 1 or 2 sentences that they write and put in a sealed envelope and put on the file. So that's protected that, that's sorted that out going forward, don't you worry. How did we manage to get a parliamentary inquiry to look at this very troubling civil liberties issue? I mean, how did we manage to get, and we had a number of days of inquiry, we had quite close scrutiny of this, and we thought we had a recommendation that said that this covert surveillance system, where you have uncontradicted applications being rubber stamped by judges with nobody checking it, needs to be fundamentally reformed, and we should be getting some kind of contradictor, at least in the proceedings, to test the evidence. How did we get it? Well, we got it because the people who were the victims of it weren't Aboriginal people, or homeless people, or young people, or people with Muslim-sounding names or wearing headscarves. The victims were some well-connected journalists and some very senior police. And I've got to say, some very senior police were very courageous in insisting on having it because it's been extremely career-limiting to them in continuing to raise this for 15 years. It's one of those few cases where the apparatus has actually struck back at people who aren't the other, and that's why we've had some checks and balances. We might get a change to police oversight out there. So, there you go.
I ought to comment too from the chair that inquiry had a great deal to do with David's sense of principle and courage.
Yeah!
And my opinion is the fastest way to end ISIS and terrorism is to find out, is to trace the money flows, who finances them.
Sure.
And why isn't that being done? And my personal theory is that the objective of war is no longer victory. It's a continuing profitability of a corporate, military, industrial, financial complex.
Yes, a slightly controversial question. Look, who would know in the Middle East who's funding who and who's participating